fantastic bits and how to preserve them. If you're just now joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're from and how many people you have with you today. My name is Patsy Mitchell. I'm an archivist with the Tennessee State Library and Archives, and I'm also co-chair of the SERI Advocacy and Outreach Subcommittee. I have just a few announcements before we move on to our panel discussion. First, we have some additional webinars coming up, so if you feel like you're not getting enough electronic records today, don't worry because the party doesn't stop. It continues with Advocacy and Electronic Records on October 12th, which is Tuesday. That's just around the corner. Then on November 16th, we have the webinar Digital Preservation Policies as Tools for Accountability, Compliance, and Clarity. I also want to draw your attention to some of our online resources. The Resource Center offers a number of materials related to managing archival records. It is a community-driven resource, and we are always looking for new submissions. We have recordings of our past webinars available on our website as well, and this webinar is also being recorded and will be available soon. And speaking of recordings, the SERI video series is available on our YouTube channel. Some of the topics we've covered are custody transfers, arrangement and description tools, advocacy, and email. This is an ongoing project that started in 2020, and we are continuing to add to that series, so keep an eye out for future videos. I also want to take a moment to recognize and thank our 2021 sponsor, Preservica. Okay, now that we've gotten through those announcements, we are really excited to bring you a panel discussion for eRecord today. We have with us today three of our esteemed colleagues, Snowden, Becker, Nadia, Dixson, and Arian Ravanbaksh. Each presenter will get a few minutes to speak on the topic of emerging file formats, and once we've heard all the presentations, we'll move on to our question and answer session. First, we're going to take a few moments to get to know our presenters. Snowden Becker's professional background includes over 25 years of experience in libraries, archives, museums, and higher education. Her research interests focus on how audiovisual materials, especially non-theatrical media, from home movies to police body cam footage, are collected and preserved as part of our cultural heritage. In 2018, she co-organized an IMLS-funded national forum on the preservation and professional education needs arising from the increased use of video recording in law enforcement agencies. And she is a past member of the video committee of the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence. She currently works as a consulting archivist for a variety of institutional, corporate, and private collections. Nadia Dixson graduated from the Simmons Archives Management and History program in 2012. She is the founding archivist of the city of Somerville. As a co-chair of New England Archivists Education Committee, she led a Python self-study course. Her research interests include digital preservation and making technology more accessible for archivists. Arian Ravanbaksh currently serves as Supervisory Records Management Policy Analyst in the Office of the Chief Records Officer at NARA. Since 2006, he has worked on and now leads the Policy and Program Support Team. Prior to coming to NARA in 2000, Mr. Ravanbaksh worked for 10 years at the Maryland State Archives, eventually becoming the Director of Geographic Services. He has served on the Board of Directors of NAGARA and as a member of the Society of American Archivists, ARMA International, and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. He holds a BA in Political Science from Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. So I think we're going to start with Snowden. Whenever you are ready.
Thank you so much, Patsy, and thanks for Becky for hosting and helping with the technical side of things. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people from state-level archives, in part because the topic I'll be talking about today is of particular relevance at the state level, given that police records are governed by the state Code of Criminal Procedures, and the duty to preserve is closely linked for evidentiary records with the statute of limitations set by the Code of Criminal Procedures for individual categories of crime. I am going to see if what worked before worked again. Yes, indeed. So I'll be talking about police records today and the specific challenges and opportunities they present to us as more and more digital video becomes enmeshed with aspects of the criminal justice system. So let's start with a nice deep breath and a calming mental image. picture a river that's deep and wide and fast flowing. Now, imagine that that river is made of technology. It's always moving. It is continually being renewed from a distant source. There's an inexorable flow from that source to the broad ocean of technology history and records created with those ever-changing kinds of technology. And public record keepers are the first stop downstream on that massive, fast-flowing river of technological change. Police records and the policies and practices that we have built around them, often very organically and on a agency by agency or region by region basis, help us look forward to other downstream challenges that will be faced by other agencies and entities. So they're a useful point of reference or a bellwether in many ways for the record keeping challenges that we'll face in the future. They also present some really unique challenges in the areas of personal privacy, public accountability and access to public records or records that are created with public funds and in the public interest. They constitute an archive of each community's traumas and transgressions. So they're intensely emotional records, intensely volatile records. Handling them has major consequences for life and liberty and social justice. They also reflect fundamental changes in society and how society constructs crime and defines criminal activity. But on the other side, police departments and the actions of individual officers are under increasingly intense scrutiny nationwide. But police records and record keeping practices, as I have observed them, continue to be understudied, underobserved, and poorly understood, even by the agencies in which those records are being kept. The record keeping function, as is so often the case, and I know we will all be nodding in understanding of this, the record keeping function is one that is very much taken for granted and tends to be thought about not at all until there is some sort of tragedy, catastrophe, or terrible event that suddenly shines a bright light on how records are created, preserved, managed, and accessed within a system. A lot of assumptions are made about record keeping that just aren't borne out by actual practice or practical realities. So I'm going to ask us to consider body cameras as a case in point, or body-worn cameras. These are just the most recent example of electronic records that create unanticipated challenges when it comes to their creation, collection, retention, and access. And I'll just run down here a quick list of the features or factors that make these records so challenging to manage. They create enormous files. Video is very, very data intensive. Video with sound, even more so. Color video, even more so. High resolution video or video with a lot of attached and automated metadata, even more so. The devices that we are using to create these video recordings tend to be creating them in proprietary formats that are encoded in such a way that it is difficult to move them out of their technical ecosystem, their vendor-based ecosystems. They tend likewise not to be interoperable. So agencies may be sort of married to a specific vendor's materials or their technology, even though those vendors make no guarantees that there will be interoperability between, say, their dash cam video systems and their body-worn camera video systems, or their custodial area surveillance systems. The authenticity and integrity issues for digital video are particularly pressing. Public trust in material that is known to be easily manipulable is easily sacrificed. So it's incredibly important that these systems be designed with clear and transparent controls and checks on things like upload, download, edits, and viewing. There are, of course, privacy implications. I love to refer to the Stanley and Steinhardt report from some years ago. It was a collaboration between the ACLU and agencies working with video records. It's called Bigger Monster, Weaker Chains. I'll put a link to that in the chat later. But Jay Stanley of the ACLU wrote something very compelling and very accurate. I'll paraphrase here and say paraphrase it as, in the absence of a national law on privacy protection, what we see is an ongoing threat to privacy. The longer files are retained, the greater the threat to privacy. Obviously, there are also policy implications when state records laws define police records as non-records, as is the case in North Carolina, for instance, which in 2016 declared that body-worn camera footage was not a public record and not subject to open records request laws. It was subject to a different set of standards for preservation, release, and public use. Often there are huge carve-outs, even in those records definitions, for retention and disposition, and there is a giant loophole in many records policies at the state level or at the jurisdictional level for retention of body-worn camera and other evidentiary video recordings beyond their statutory retention period if they are being used for the purposes of training, education, or other internal use. So that means that when you go to the law enforcement agency conferences, as I have done, and looked around at the technology vendors, often they are using real footage from systems that they have installed at law enforcement agencies, real footage of real people in the process of committing crimes as marketing material. And it is possible for the right to be forgotten to be seriously compromised by these uses of evidentiary material and public records, or video recordings that are specifically not defined as public records, but are still available and circulating within public agencies. And of course, most of these unanticipated challenges are things that come as a surprise to a lot of agencies in public administration, could easily have been foreseen if archivists were asked or consulted earlier in the process, or asked to think through the implications of implementing these systems and regimes. So another aspect of this is, what do we learn? How can we take lessons of history from this history? First of all, we can turn our archivist's eye, the left-hand facing face of Janus, the Roman god of archives, to the past. We can look at the history of technology adoption and use of technology-based record making in law enforcement agencies and electronic media as evidence, and see patterns that can be instructive to us, that we can learn from and apply towards the future, anticipate problems going forward. For instance, the cycle of internal resistance, eventual acceptance, and external review is one that we have seen with dashboard cameras and with custodial interview recordings. Initially, in the case of both of those technologies, which came into common use 20 and 40 years ago, respectively, we can see that police departments were initially, and individual police officers and police unions were often very resistant to their use, feeling like they were going to be exposing the inner workings of the justice system, exposing sort of trade secrets of the police and how they worked, and exposing them to risk and vulnerability. Eventually, there comes a revelation point where law enforcement agencies that are resistant to adoption of this technology realize that it's also exculpatory for them. Custodial interview recordings can reduce the amount of spurious claims of abuse in custody, for instance. They can provide some substantive, sort of qualitative backing for a confession, for instance. The suspect's demeanor during a confession has been described as the confession itself is what gets the conviction. It's how they act when they're making the confession that adds years to the sentence. So making criminal behavior more visible actually has been seen to have benefits for police. So that leads to an acceptance of the technology. Acceptance and widespread use of the technology then furthers external review and the ability for social scholars to look at the police practices used in custodial interviews and have empirical evidence for and a better way of understanding and affirming the phenomenon of coerced interrogation or coerced confession. It has changed fundamentally the way police departments conduct custodial interviews and try to reach confessions and document those confessions. It has made the process more transparent and subjected it to more rigorous review and evaluation and revision. So we can enter, and the same thing has happened for dashboard cameras. Police were reluctant to have those interactions between patrol cars and the public be more visible. But then through the advent of TV shows like Cops, they have seen that this actually can be have a PR function as well. That it can be part of demonstrating the police view of events, and has come to in the case of the show Cops, has provided a body of work for a corpus of records for review and revision and rethinking about how police are depicted in reality television. So we can also see that public records laws and policies have a huge impact on local record keeping practices. And again, this is primarily occurring at the state level and is relevant to everybody here. Whether or not jurisdictions keep body-worn camera regimes after piloting them, there will be a corpus of records, very large, very cumbersome, very difficult to manage, that we are stuck with as records managers. And so it behooves us to keep an eye on those policies, understand their implications for those who will be inheriting those records from those systems. And we know from 100 or more years of police photography that often that preservation function or that long-term historical active records to historical records transition has not been very well thought through, very well managed, or very well practiced at the state level and at public records levels. That, of course, has implications for personal privacy, for public agency reputations, and for us hardworking archivists who end up having to solve gnarly problems like, how do we identify people? How do we protect the rights of the dead, the guilty, and the innocent when we are faced with large corpora of records? And how do we provide ethical access to those records? I believe that records managers could have a really positive impact if they were involved earlier in the processes of technology adoption and policy development for electronic record making. I'm sure everybody here agrees with me on that one. I think that we would play an especially important role in law enforcement as a consultative force and a not necessarily a Cassandra, but somebody who can raise those questions and try to ensure that people are thinking about those long-term record-keeping implications at the point of technology adoption. And of course, we must keep a close eye on those policies and technological developments, because we know whether we work at a state or public agency or in a small town historical society, in a regional or community-based archive, the problems that public agencies are facing with public and police records are eventually going to be coming for us. So when we know that police departments are using all kinds of cell phone video and social media as part of their work in keeping the peace, we know that we'll be keeping those pieces down the road as part of our cultural and community histories. So I see that there are a lot of emerging opportunities here for the skill set that archivists and records managers have, that forward forward-looking, backward-looking tendency in our work to be of real relevance in places that we don't necessarily think archivists as having a role. I certainly have been working on that as an archivist and an academic in the context of the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence, or SWIG-DE. This is a group that is open to all. You are welcome to apply to attend meetings of this. They meet 3 times a year. You're welcome to apply to attend as a guest and just find out about things. They work with digital documents, digital forensics, and digital video. And they are working to ensure quality and consistency, foment best practices documents, and guidelines for use organization-wide. There are other national and state and regional level associations for property and evidence, which are also a great source of news and information, training and certification related to digital records that have evidentiary value in the legal sense, not in the archival appraisal sense. On a local level and just sort of in your own backyard, it's a great idea to reach out to your municipal, county, or regional law enforcement leadership and those who are working directly with evidentiary records, especially those in emerging or proprietary formats, just to get a sense of what troubles they're having, how you can be of mutual benefit to one another. You may have in your archive, for instance, obsolete technology that public agencies could be using to have access to digital information, digital signals in obsolete formats. Because it's agency to agency, you can assure a closed chain of custody and ensure authenticity, integrity, and reliability for those recordings. You can also get a heads up on what might be coming your way in terms of records that you would need the skills and knowledge to deal with. So the people that are doing that work can vary quite a bit from agency to agency. The responsibility tends to be assigned on a rather haphazard basis, not necessarily consistently. There isn't one person at any agency or a single title involved in dealing with audiovisual evidence, but it could be the property room manager, it could be the IT department, it could be administrative or support staff within an agency. But I highly, highly encourage everybody to do that networking and make those connections. It will lead to greater information exchange and benefits for our entire community. I look forward to your questions, and I'm going to pass this on now to Nadia.
Thank you so much, Snowden. This is it's an honor to be included with this group. And I want to say that Snowden makes 2 points that I want to highlight that I was not originally thinking about talking about. One of the reasons why I am talking about Slack exports is because I've done the groundwork to get into those conversations about when technology is adopted. So even if I'm not there before we decided to do it, I was there at the very earliest points in the process, and my concerns were heard and respected. And we've actually, one of the reasons why I have to deal with Slack exports is because we've decided that this is not a good records management or archival decision for our communications. So we are no longer working with Slack. Likewise, just this morning, I was talking with our police department about video. So getting into those rooms, it's about doing that groundwork. So that being said, my presentation is going to be a lot more of the nitty gritty, like this is how we move the files around, because that's what's really exciting to me. In my bio, I've talked a little bit about doing the Python self-study course. This is kind of the fruits of that self-study course. This is easier than I thought it was going to be. And I'm hoping that this will be an inspiration for those of us who don't have a lot of resources to see that we can actually do things. So today I'm going to talk to you about records created in Slack. And because these are like email communications, they have a retention period of Massachusetts of at least 3 to 5 years. In this instance, these records were created in response to the pandemic. So this is a historic event. There's good argument for keeping these records indefinitely. Slack exports are in the JSON format, so I'm going to go over a little bit about what JSON is, and why it is being used, and where you're going to expect to see it going forward in the future, because I think that this is a record format that we're going to see more of.
Nadia, I think you might have muted yourself.
I'm sorry, folks. This is my first WebEx event. I can't believe I've made it through the entire pandemic without using WebEx, but the interface is just enough off that I'm going to make some mistakes. So Slack is, if you haven't ran into it before, its stated goal is to replace email. It's a web-based application that displays threaded messages. It's a platform for video calls. It integrates standard Office applications. The thing that I think people are most excited about is that there are open channels that you can use to broadcast to everyone in your organization. You can create private channels. You can use direct messages. So being able to scale your communication is one of the features of Slack that is supposed to make it more efficient in communication. But that being said, it presents some real challenges for government organizations with records compliance, particularly if you're a small organization. I did talk to some other groups who are using Slack who have like a department of developers and an IT department that is staffed who can handle, managing their own servers. We don't have that in the city of Somerville. So Slack presented the challenge of both making sure that all of our records that were created in Slack were kept, and being able to export those records. So the direct messages and private channels, any instance can create that, but if you're on a basic plan, they don't allow you to export that. You have to be at an enterprise level to be able to export those automatically. And even if you're paying for that higher level of service, Slack suggests that you use a third-party e-discovery service and data logger in order to make sure that you are retaining all of their information. They make no guarantee that they're going to keep those things. Likewise, if you're on a basic plan, they only give you the option of exporting the most recent 10,000 messages. So obviously that presents another set of challenges. Finally, getting those messages out of Slack and being able to present them to like your law department in order to reply to public records requests. They don't give you a good way to make those exports easy to read for human beings. So after a great deal of negotiation with Slack, even though we were on a most basic plan, I was able to export the files. And this is what it looks like. You can see that there are folders for each of our channels. There are folders describing the channels and JSON at the bottom. There's a separate file for users. And the challenge with Slack is reintegrating all of these individual files. This is what a JSON file looks like. It's a lot like XML, but obviously your law office is going to be a little bit frustrated with you if you present this to them as the thing that they need to redact. So looking at this, I knew that we were going to have some sort of challenge in making this actually usable, even if we could preserve text files easily. So JSON, the reason that we're seeing it when you might think XML is a much more standard way to create structured data. This is an explanation from Wikipedia. It's an open standard file format, but unlike XML, it contains arrays and dictionaries, other data structures that are native to programming languages. Likewise, with XML, you need a parser in your programs in order to be able to process it. JSON lets you skip all of those steps. So this saves developers time. This is why we see JSON being used. Likewise, this is a really common way for data to be transferred between web servers. So wherever we've got a service that our organizations are using that's web-based, likely our experts are going to start looking like JSON. So we're going to need to know how to reintegrate those files outside of the applications that they're being created in. So when I first looked at these files, my worry was that we were going to have to like host these on a SQL server and create queries and then deal with a really ugly format. Luckily, someone has done the hard work for me. There is a Slack export viewer. The person who created this says that it is ideal for people who run over their 10,000 message limit. It took one line of code to install. This is, what I put in my terminal, the install Slack export viewer, and then you type in the second command to run it, and you get something that is comparable to what Slack looks like. So this is what our Slack instance ran through the Slack viewer appears as. It's comparable to Slack. It's readable, and it's outside of the app. So that being said, there are, of course, still preservation issues. You lose some of the look and feel. Documents that have been shared in Slack, I haven't been able to find a way to retrieve those. Luckily, most of those were stored on in other systems that we were able to capture. Likewise, you've got the web archiving problem of external links. So we need to capture those links before people start pulling things down from the beginning of the pandemic. And because there are a lot of integrations with other, either common office applications, a larger setup would create workflows, and there are different ways to modify it. If you're doing those things, there's going to be more issues that likely this solution is not going to be able to help you with. So my next steps for preservation is to run httrack or another web crawler. I'm afraid that by referencing httrack, you'll all know how long it's been since I've looked at digital preservation. It's been a couple of years. I'm sure that there's probably something better. But I'm going to take the original zip files from our export, this Slack viewer script, our files from httrack, and then I'm going to create a readme.txt file, and I'm going to upload all of that into Preserver.co. The readme text file is obviously not a big leap forward in how we handle digital preservation, but because I'm an office of one, this seems to be the best way to document how all these files relate to each other. And it's actually something that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't worked with the digital curation network. I'm just going to skip ahead to these resources. I was lucky that I had been introduced to JSON through the digital curation network, which they have a project where they are creating primers for different file formats. And I actually worked on writing the primer for GeoJSON as well as Google Docs. So as we're encountering these new emerging formats, this is going to be a great resource where someone has already thought of what we need to do to make these mostly readable, mostly understandable at this moment. The big difference I find between digital curation and digital preservation that you find in archives is, curation is focused on research data. It's focused mainly in research universities and their repositories. They're not focused on long-term digital preservation, but this is a good way to get started, and it's a good way to augment your digital preservation program, thinking about things like the curate model and the FAIR principles. FAIR standing for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These are principles that came out of the research data management groups. but they are a good way to think about the things that we want to accomplish as well. So I look forward to hearing everyone's question. Thank you.
And next up, we have Arian.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nadia and Snowden, for those very interesting presentations to tee up my conversation. And thank you to COSA for the invitation to speak today and join everyone in this panel. Good morning if you're on the West Coast, good afternoon if you're on the East Coast or in the Midwest, and good evening if you're around the world. What I'd like to talk about is some the emerging challenges that we are seeing at the National Archives. As stated in the introduction, or at least my team is responsible for federal records management policy and guidance. We are the team that issues records management policy across the federal government. And these are the things, this is one topic area that I'm sure everybody will be familiar with once we get into it. I, of course, do the disclaimer, these opinions are mine, and not the official opinions of the National Archives. So I want to set the stage around collaboration platforms, because this is the area that I'm going to talk about. And by collaboration platforms, I mean things like WebEx or Zoom or Google Hangout, or pick your flavor. We've all gone through the last 18 months and we've all had to do different things, and they all work differently. But ultimately, if a government entity is using this, they are creating records, and that does ask questions that need to be answered, and the policies need to be defined, and that's what we're working on. So, of course, prior to 2020, there is no single federal government-wide collaboration platform. Agencies have their own configuration and security controls. One of the frustrations that we have at NARA when we try to communicate with all our federal agencies is there are different requirements. Some people can access Google, no problem. Other entities in the government lock Google down and say, no, you have to use a different platform, or tell them that they have to go log in on a personal device to watch NARA content, which of course is problematic for different reasons. So that gets, this is the area, obviously presents a lot of challenges. In non-interoperable product choices, of course, people get what they get. Things don't necessarily talk well together, don't play well together. And every agency has different policies on retentions, records creation. The state of NARA guidance that sort of is relevant in all these areas is, I think these two products and sort of a legal update. NARA Bulletin 2009-02 is called Managing Records in Multi-Agency Environments. And I will admit that when we wrote that guidance that's fiscal year 2009. So actually we were writing that guidance in 2008. The driver behind it was wikis, essentially, that agencies were starting to collaborate together on wikis. And we wanted to set up some guardrails or some rules of the road for when agencies collaborate on a third-party site. So agency A contributes, agency B contributes, and it resides somewhere else. Who is responsible for the records management responsibility? Who has the records management responsibility for that content that exists on a separate site? And that's really from the policy-making standpoint, that's where 2009-02 comes from. But when you read it today, it does reflect sort of this collaboration space issue. How do agencies that use a WebEx meeting, or they're using Microsoft Teams, or they're using Zoom, or whatever they're using, how do they collect the records and how do they manage them? Of course, our capstone policy is very well known in the archival world. That's the policies. Basically, we've deferred, sort of added for as far as email goes, making the heads of agencies and the senior officials in agencies, making those email collections permanent. We have been asked many times if we're going to expand capstone to include other kinds of records. I think the first thing we'll probably have to incorporate is specific guidance on, for lack of a better way to describe them, electronic messages. So think text and chats and things like that, which are actively excluded from capstone as it's currently written. So that's the next logical step, that we start talking about electronic messaging and electronic messages. And that does open the conversation to other kinds of records. And then there was a marker put down by Congress in Public Law 116-2083, which for those who don't follow Congress, this is the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020. So it's the waning days of the Trump administration. And this is the bill that funds the Department of Defense. It's 1,500 pages long. If you open that bill and you go to page 1100 and something, there's one section called the Electronic Message Preservation Act. And that put down a marker or redefined how agencies need to think about electronic messages. I will say we weren't actively following the conversation around the defense authorization bill, but as Congress is wont to do when they're trying to get a piece of legislation passed, they cram a lot of stuff in there. And this one of the things they crammed in there was this Electronic Message Preservation Act. It is literally a page and a half in that 1,500 page defense authorization bill, but it does kind of put down a marker on where we need to, how NARA needs to think about electronic messages and how we need to preserve them, and how it puts responsibilities on agencies, mostly around reporting, how they're doing and how they're capturing and managing their electronic messages. So that takes us to 2020, and I thought this was the most appropriate painting, 110 years old, but it kind of sums up everybody's 2020. Without further comment, I'll go to some of the things that we did in response. So pandemic happens, everybody switches to a remote environment, all the federal government goes to work from home. And by April, and again in October, we came out with a we think pretty comprehensive FAQ on records management during COVID, just trying to cover all the bases. As sort of the questions that we were getting, whether they were something simple as one of the simple questions we got, can a federal employee shred a record at home, or is that appropriate destruction, and things like that. Addressing those kind of questions, and of course addressing things like how to deal with sort of the existing record schedules, things like that. Our Fermi project, I talked about that at a previous COSA event. That's our Federal Electronic Modernization Initiative. One of the key components of that is leveraging shared services as the government is moving to shared services across the federal government. They're building out systems to do travel, human resources, grants, things like that, kind of administrative functions. But the government, the General Services Administration in particular, is really driving the idea that the government should not have to buy, there's 250 federal agencies, depending on how you count. They should not have to buy 272 travel systems. They should buy 2 or 3 and have those standardized and have everybody use those. So one of the things Fermi is trying to do is to leverage that movement and build into those shared services basic records management requirements, so agencies don't have to worry about them. Obviously, when you tell agencies, hey, buy this system, it has everything you need regarding at least the hooks and the records management requirements, that's progress, because then they can focus on the more important things, or the records that maybe are more high value, but that these things are covered, let's focus on these other agencies. So we've been in active partnership with the General Services Administration. And so I'd say earlier this year, the Office of Government-Wide Policy, which is a GSA entity, reached out to us and they said, hey, we've been reading your NARA Bulletin 2009-02. We'd like you to update it. And we think it would be helpful to update it in light of everybody using Zoom, Google, Microsoft Teams, whatever have you. So we'd like to work with you on that. And what came out of that was a focus group. We had focus groups with agencies on collaboration tools. And I'll briefly go through some of the things we've learned and some of the things we heard. And so what we heard when we got, and we did these focus groups in the summer, so June, July timeframe. We talked to 10 agencies. Agencies, of course, they differed in their interpretation of our guidance, of our bulletin. They used their own approaches to records management when using these collaboration tools, both in internal and external settings. So even if like one office and another office in the same agency were communicating, there were different rules around that. They just didn't understand, who was preserving it, who wasn't preserving it. And of course, sort of the next bullet, agencies tend to turn off features or do not fully utilize new technology out of concern that the records being created would not be captured, which you don't want to see. At least the Office of Government-Wide Policy's position was we don't want to see technology innovation being stymied because of records management requirements. So we need to work together now. And inconsistency across agencies reduced the collaboration and created friction. And it also created sort of what irritated, I think one of the things that irritated GSA the most is that agencies would have the same tool, but they would be configured differently. So it would work differently in different agencies based on records management requirements or internal security operational requirements, things like that. They want to make OGP's position is we want to make this as seamless as possible for agencies. So can NAR fix that? So out of this discussions and sort of the findings, they came up with these handful of recommendations. I think these are interesting, and these kind of frame our next steps at NAR of where we're going to take the guidance and hopefully get some more information on this topic. That agencies should be encouraged to take the same approach for virtual meeting as for in-person meetings. So we need to clarify what that actually means. That if you got an in-person meeting, you get 10 agencies together, the rule for a long time, the rules have been, if decisions are made, if minutes were sufficient for record keeping, they would be sufficient for the official record, then even in a virtual space, that rule should still hold. So just because you have the ability, what that boils down to is just because you have the ability to record a meeting doesn't mean that you have to record a meeting. You may want to record a meeting, but you don't have to record a meeting. Video conference chats, like our chat window here in this meeting, should be treated as the same as in-person conversations, side conversations in meetings, and not necessarily considered by default a record. So what we're not saying that it isn't a record, but the focus group was saying, let's not make that the default position, because that could be, and I think we've all can imagine this experience where you're sitting in a room with 10 people and you have a sidebar conversation with the person sitting next to you about something. Relevant, not relevant, doesn't matter. But if that was not captured, that's not part of that meeting. And that virtual meeting participation should be treated the same as in-person conversation. So things like that. And I made the recording point earlier. Again, these are the recommendations that came out of these agencies that got together to talk about this. Interagency document collaboration. So if we're all using a Google Doc, this speaks directly to everybody editing a Google Doc together. It does require some kind of agreement and understanding. And that's what we said in our bulletin 2009-02. But even 10 years later, 12 years later, agencies weren't comfortable with that approach, that they could all agree which agency was going to be the record keeper. So if agency A and agency B were collaborating on a Google Doc together, which agency would have the record keeping responsibilities? That we said in the bulletin 10 years ago, that had to be clarified before you got into that space, and that wasn't happening. We also said that officially we'd like the focus groups wanted us to get to a position where one agency would be the owner for record for collaboration. So that would be alleviating that burden of maintaining copies in separate places. And one of the things I think the focus group was really vocal about is participation by capstone officials. So getting back to our capstone policy, just because a capstone official attends a meeting, it shouldn't change how the records are created. So if they're not active participant, they're just in the meeting, listening, they're just watching the meeting. That doesn't necessarily mean because they're capstone, it has to be kept permanently, right? That's sort of the yardstick in federal agencies. A capstone official touches it, it becomes permanent. That's not what the policy says, but I think that's a misunderstanding that's out there. So those were the recommendations of the focus groups. Our next steps, this is what we're doing. So we have a ongoing formal assessment of collaboration tools. So our team has taken some of these focus group findings and created its own separate set of questions. Some of them overlap. And we are doing a formal assessment. For those of you who don't know what a formal assessment is, NARA has in our office an oversight and inspection team. Part of what they do is oversight on federal agencies' compliance with the Federal Records Act. The full level of that is they have an inspection process, and they handle our unauthorized disposition cases. So when you read in the paper that agency X has been accused of throwing X records out, that team gets involved and does the preliminary legwork and starts that investigation. Another function they do is what we call a formal assessment, and that's sort of it's not quite a full-blown inspection with the same level of audit rigor and requirement. It is more of a, hey, let's investigate this technology, let's see what the challenges are, and learn. It's really a learning mechanism for how agencies are creating a certain class of records. When the slides get distributed, which I think they will, or they'll be available on the website, that'll be a link to the NARA webpage where you can see all the assessments we've recently done. That assessment will obviously feed the need for my team to go write guidance, an update of that bulletin. We've also established, and this predates the pandemic, we've been working on this area for a while. We have an Office 365 Microsoft user group of federal agencies that use Office 365. I will say, without sounding like a commercial for Microsoft, that's the numbers are like 95% of the federal government uses Microsoft Office 365 in one form or another. So it is the predominant player in the market by far. NAR is a Google shop, so I'll put that out there. It makes it hard for us to collaborate in that same way because everybody else is a Microsoft shop. And so anyway, we established a user group to get federal agencies together to talk specifically around the records management challenges on Office 365, on the Office 365 platform. That's open to anybody. It's very federal centric, but we have monthly meetings. The most recent one was a presentation from Microsoft itself on some of the features that they're rolling out or planning to roll out in Office 365. So if you're a government entity that's using Office 365 and you want to speak to records people, just reach out and I'll be happy to add you to that list. And of course, our one-stop shop for all of our records management updates is our blog, Records Express, where as we issue things or update things, we will post to our blog. So make a link to that. And now I think we're at our question slide. So that's a good point to sort of for me to end and turn it back over to Patsy to lead us through any questions or conversations that came up.
Thank you so much. Those were wonderful presentations. As Arian said, we're going to move into the question and answer portion of today's webinar. If you have any questions for our presenters, you can drop those in the chat. I've also included contact information for all of us in case you need to follow up with us after the webinar. And while we're waiting for questions to start trickling in, I do have one or two to get us started. So in 2021, what do you see as the most viable way to securely store and serve records that are generated in collaborative platforms or through non-traditional communication methods like mobile messaging apps? And I'm sure that depends a lot on the environment that you're working in.
So I'll take the first attempt at that. I think so. I think the first thing you have to do, the most secure, at the end of the day, the most secure way is to just probably build out some kind of, the government's been trying to go digital for 20 years. And I think one of the ways that people have thought about that, or at least across the government, is getting to documents to the point where they would be paper, that they were sort of getting to the paper replicant. And for me, that doesn't mean paper anymore. That means something static like a PDF or something. It's exporting it out. So that Nadia's point about exporting the Slack messages out of Slack, getting them out of that platform, I think is critical. So you do have to get it out of the platform so you can control it. The problem in some of the virtual multi-agency collaborative environments that we're seeing is they never freeze. They never get to that point where they're frozen, because people can always go in and make changes, and people can always go in and make comments or corrections, things like that. So I think that's the challenge. The challenge is getting some rules of the road around how those platforms need to function and how the records need to be captured and managed. And that's what our policy team is tasked with doing, is coming up with those rules of the engagement. So I think right now it's not a good answer. It's like there is no good way, right? And we're trying to get to a better way of doing it.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, that sort of led into another question that I have. How important is emulation to your preservation and access work? What are the limitations or drawbacks to attempting to emulate that original user experience? How important do you think that is?
I'll jump in on this one. This is really the first time that I've used emulation. Like, really, I would say that most of the things that we were producing before were PDFs, they were Word documents, they were things that were easy to capture. And so it hadn't been an issue. I think that a lot of the times we get caught up on things like look and feel, but particularly with government records, the important thing is the content. And we just making sure that the content is the thing that we capture is the most important from my perspective.
It's an interesting question for evidentiary material. There's a standard, there are Daubert criteria that you have to meet for evidentiary material that has been transformed in some way to be admissible. And unfortunately, the video files particularly tend to be a real black box. Proprietary video files tend to be a real black box. So for people who are working with in a forensic way with digital video, being able to make sort of, perjury-proof assertions that you have migrated, moved forward, transformed, or extracted video data in an authentic way, trustworthy way, or that is that you can guarantee has not affected its visual quality or content in some meaningful way is really difficult. So I think that one of the answers for evidentiary media is going to be pushing for more open source, for opened source, for better documentation and clarity from vendors, and there's a shared interest on the part of record keepers and evidence managers to make proprietary formats more open in specific circumstances or specific reasons. And that's something that's echoed across the media archiving preservation community. For instance, for feature filmmakers and the DCP format, which is frequently encrypted for market reasons, but archivists that have an interest in preserving the feature media of the present have an interest in making that format more accessible for preservation reasons. So I think that there's a large area of shared interest, and this is another argument for greater collaboration, greater cross-community communication, and recognition that that proprietary formats are the enemy of preservation in many, many ways, and that we will go further if we are working together and advocating for responsibility on the corporate level for creating adequate documentation and enabling understanding of these formats when they get complicated enough that they're not like film or video, where we can just sort of take apart the signal and see what it's made of really easily. That's just going to be essential for us to not end up with a blank 21st century evidentiary and historical record.
We had a question come in through the chat. I'm going to read it out to you all. What do you see as the possibilities for working with public sector legal teams to get more familiar with the negotiation stage for new digital tools? Essentially, how can we work with our lawyers to carve out room for the government to make demands of these service providers?
So this is Arian, and I'll take the first answer or attempt at that. And one of the things I'll say is part of the partnership through the user group that we have is to start working with Microsoft. Now, I'm not naive enough to know. I don't believe that that's actually going to move the needle. Like even the federal government, the amount of federal agencies that use Microsoft, it's still 0.1% of Microsoft's bottom line, essentially, right? It doesn't make a difference. But I think having that conversation or getting that group together and elevating that voice about, hey, this is a community of people that's using your product and has identified some real records management challenges and configuration and how your tool works. And getting that, at least having a group of agencies together, I think that's been really strong for us. Because what we're able to do then is say, the user community of Office 365 users in the federal government has identified these issues, Microsoft. And we've made that public, and we've shared it through each of those agencies has a Microsoft technical representative, and we've shared it with them. So we're having that conversation at sort of that user level where we've identified some of the challenges and obstacles. And I think the other point in that comment or the question was working with the lawyer folks as they're sitting down. That's part of at least in the federal government, the advantage we have is that's part of any acquisition process for a tool, for a new technology. So if an agency or an entity wants to purchase a new thing, they have to go through legal to make sure that the contracting terms are correct, or whatever agreement they're getting into, a licensing agreement they're getting into, is appropriate. And one of the things that the lawyer community, or at least at the federal level, again, is really good at is making sure that at least the records there is a records management component built into those contracts and to those legal agreements. So we've opened the doors a little bit, and I know it's hard to trickle that down to smaller city governments or state governments or local governments because they've got their own resource challenges. But hopefully the work we're doing at the federal level does help at the end of the day.
Go right ahead, Nadia. Sorry, jump on it.
These are definitely things that help, and they give us a model to use. So, for example, our law department has included records management language in our contracts now. And hearing it from all levels, I know that it seemed like Slack's people had not really recognized what it meant to work in a highly regulated environment. Right? They're mostly focused on software developers. So hearing those issues, this was the first time they were hearing it. I would hope that Microsoft had heard it from us before, though.
I'll just add that that there are a couple of possibilities I see here. Part of what we bring to the table as a community is that historical awareness, and I think that there is no more convincing argument than the lessons of the past. You know, having clear and compelling examples of where these kinds of situations have gone wrong in the past, and use cases where you can anticipate there will be problems in the future or similar points of friction in the future, where there is lacking functionality or essential functionality that is part of the specs that are kind of non-negotiable deal breakers for you. I think being able to point to things and say, like, look, we know this has happened. This cost us money the last time this happened. It created this many hours of remedial work or exposed our agency to this form of liability. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again. Getting that on the record is really important. Just having that be part of the discussion discussion. And like, especially if you're dealing with lawyers, like as soon as you say legal liability, like this exposes us to liability, that's when they may start to take interest in a way that they wouldn't if you were again, like sort of the Cassandra voice. Like, what if this happens? Well, it might not, we don't know. We'll deal with that when it comes up. Like, you know, being able to like keep notes on when you know what hits the fan, and you know, be the person that says like, we can't let this happen again, and it will happen unless we have these features and functionality, or unless we have these exemptions or these needs met as part of our agreement, or we hold our vendors to account for providing this service that we need to have at a non-exorbitant cost, putting the liability for unanticipated costs on the vendor instead. I think also recognizing that you do have the ability to make demands of service providers, that you don't have to buy their product if it does not meet your minimum standards, and that often it feels like the decision has already been made before you even get to the bargaining table or to the sales pitch. It seems like somebody upstairs from you has already decided that you're going to buy this product whether you like it or not. So again, being on the record with the issues you have and saying this is going to create problems for us later, and is such that it could prevent us buying your product at all. And we would be happy to work with you on designing solutions and collaborate with you on designing solutions that meet our needs. They will likely meet the needs of other customers as well.
Okay, I'm sorry to say that we have gone over our allotted hour. Time flies when you're having fun. See, I just want to remind everyone to stay connected and informed of COSA's future offerings. You can do so by visiting our website or following us on Twitter and Facebook. Also, if you're interested in serving with SERI, we would love to have your help on any one of our subcommittees. If you want to learn more about those opportunities, please reach out to me. And Josh Hager is putting in the chat the link to the next webinar if you just need more e-records in your life. And one more thing, when you exit WebEx, there will be a brief evaluation form. We would really appreciate you completing those and helping us plan future webinars. Thank you again to our wonderful presenters and everyone who attended. Have a wonderful afternoon and happy e-records day.